Have you ever wondered whom to turn to when injustice rises against you, or when people act with betrayal and hostility without reason? Do you believe that, even when we are surrounded by opposition or persecution, God remains our help and defender? Psalm 54 is a sincere cry for deliverance in the midst of danger. Also written by David, this psalm reveals the trust of one who, even when threatened by enemies, chooses to place their security in the name of the Lord and not in their own strength. In this psalm, we find a cry for help, but also a powerful declaration of trust. Psalm 54 shows us that when people rise against us with violence or injustice, God remains attentive and ready to act on behalf of those who seek Him. It reminds us that the Lord does not ignore the suffering of the righteous and that His help comes at the right time. It is a psalm that strengthens the heart in the midst of adversity and renews the hope of those who trust that God is the helper and sustainer of life. Before we continue this deep study of Psalm 54, I invite you to share this video with someone who needs to understand that, even when we are surrounded by opposition, betrayal, or injustice, the Lord's help remains real and powerful. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to continue walking with us on this journey through the Psalms, a journey that engraves in the heart the certainty that, even when adversaries rise and the situation seems threatening, God remains sovereign and His deliverance is still at work, and that is a reason for renewed confidence, steadfast faith, and true hope. Psalm 54 teaches us that God does not ignore the cry of those who are persecuted or treated unjustly. He hears their plea for help and sustains those who trust in His name. It is an invitation to reflect on where we seek help when we face opposition. Do we rely only on human strength, or do we turn to the Lord as our true defender? As you watch this video, you will be guided on a journey that moves from a cry for deliverance to trust in divine help, from the anguish caused by enemies to the security that comes from knowing that God sustains those who seek Him. Prepare to feel the weight of human vulnerability, but also the peace that arises when we recognize that the Lord is our helper. Here, we discover that even when adversaries rise, the Lord's deliverance remains the answer. If your soul has been troubled as you face moments of opposition, injustice, or persecution, if you have felt the anguish of being surrounded by people who do not respect truth or justice, this psalm is for you. If, deep in your heart, there is a sincere desire to seek God's help even when the situation seems threatening, this psalm is for you. Psalm 54 reveals the contrast between the hostility of those who rise against the righteous and the trust of those who cry out for the Lord's help. Here, we learn that true security is not found in human strength. It is found in calling upon the name of God and trusting in His powerful intervention. In this psalm, we will dive verse by verse, following a sincere cry for deliverance and a powerful declaration of trust in divine help. Each verse leads us along a path that begins with the affliction caused by adversaries and ends in the certainty that God sustains those who seek Him. Stay with us until the end, because we will offer a prayer based on Psalm 54, a deep prayer prepared to strengthen our faith, renew our trust in the Lord's help, and anchor our hearts in God's faithfulness. It will be a moment of spiritual positioning, where we will declare that our security is not in human strength, but in the name of the Lord who saves, sustains, and defends those who trust in Him.
Verse 1. O God, save me by your name, and vindicate me by your power.
David begins this psalm with a direct and urgent cry. He doesn't start by describing his situation at length, but immediately invokes the name of God. This reveals a faith that knows exactly whom to turn to in times of threat. The psalmist understands that true deliverance does not depend on human ability, but on divine intervention. By calling upon God's name, he acknowledges His authority, character, and faithfulness. The name of the Lord represents His holy identity and His commitment to those who seek Him. When David asks to be saved by your name, he is appealing to divine reputation. In biblical thought, God's name is not merely a title, but an expression of who He is. To call upon the name of the Lord means to trust in His justice, holiness, and mercy. David knows that God does not abandon those who belong to Him. This request reveals profound trust in the Lord's character. The salvation requested here arises from the relationship between God and His people. The second part of the verse presents another important element: vindicate me by your power. David does not ask for personal vengeance, but for divine justice. He understands that God has the authority to judge any situation correctly. The Lord's power is not merely brute force, but moral power that restores what has been wounded. The psalmist entrusts his cause to God. This demonstrates confidence that the Lord sees beyond appearances. This verse reveals a powerful combination of faith and humility. David doesn't try to solve everything on his own, nor does he rely solely on human strategies. He recognizes that he needs God's intervention for justice to prevail. Trust in the Lord's power frees the heart from the anxiety of having to control everything. The psalmist knows that God is able to act at the right time. Therefore, he transforms his affliction into prayer. We also perceive here a profound spiritual awareness. David asks not only for physical protection, but for divine intervention based on God's justice. He desires that truth be established and that evil not prevail. The psalmist's cry springs from a heart that believes in the Lord's righteousness. This trust strengthens the soul even in the midst of danger. When faith turns to the character of God, fear loses some of its power. In modern times, this verse teaches us to seek God's help before anything else. In moments of injustice, persecution, or conflict, we are invited to call upon the name of the Lord. Applying this verse means recognizing that our true security lies in God's character and power. Instead of reacting only with anxiety or despair, we learn to transform our struggles into prayer. When we trust in divine justice, we find peace even before the solution appears. To reflect, do I seek God immediately when faced with injustice, or do I try to solve everything on my own? Is my trust truly in God's power and character, or in my own strategies? What would change in my life if I learned to surrender my battles into the Lord's hands from the beginning?
Verse 2. O God, hear the words of my mouth. Give attention to the meditation of my heart.
David continues his prayer, revealing a deep trust in God's attention. He not only speaks, but asks the Lord to hear his words and also perceive what is happening within his heart. This shows that true prayer is not limited to what is spoken with the lips. It is born within, in the silent meditation of the soul. God is not a distant listener. He is a Father who perceives every breath, every thought, and every intention. By mentioning the words of my mouth, David acknowledges that prayer needs to be expressed. Speaking with God is an act of relationship, not an empty ritual. When we place our words before the Lord, we open our hearts honestly. Prayer becomes a channel of communion, where the soul finds refuge and direction. It is not about eloquence, but about sincerity. When he asks God to grant the meditation of my heart, David points to something even deeper. God sees what no one else sees. Often there are feelings we cannot explain, pains we don't know how to put into words. Even so, the Lord understands. He knows thoughts even before they become words. This verse also reveals that God cares as much about what we say as about what we think. There is no separation between our outward and inward lives before Him. True faith involves integrity, words that reflect a heart aligned with God. When mind and heart walk together in the presence of the Lord, prayer becomes alive and powerful. Furthermore, the verse reminds us that God responds not only to the sound of prayer, but to the intention behind it. There are prayers that echo in heaven because they spring from a humble and dependent heart. David is not just asking for help, He is opening his soul completely before God, trusting that the Lord knows every detail of his need. In these times, this verse invites us to live a true spirituality, where we hide nothing from God. In a world full of masks, the Lord continues to seek sincere hearts. We can speak to him about our joys, our fears, our doubts, and our most intimate struggles. He is not scandalized by our weaknesses. He draws near to those who speak truthfully. When we learn to place both our words and our thoughts before God, we discover that we are never alone. There is a God who listens, understands, and responds in due time. To reflect, have I been speaking to God only with prepared words, or have I been opening my heart sincerely before him? What is there in my heart's meditation today that I may not yet have placed before the Lord? Is my inner life aligned with the words of faith that I declare?
Verse 3. For foreigners have risen up against me, and tyrants seek to take my life. They do not set God before them.
David reveals here the intensity of the danger he is facing. He describes his enemies as strangers, people who rise up against him without loyalty, without commitment, and without mercy. This detail shows that the threat comes not only from common adversaries, but from people capable of acting without consideration or compassion. The feeling is one of total vulnerability. David is surrounded by forces that show no respect for life or for God's purpose. By calling these men tyrants, the psalmist exposes the nature of the hearts of those who persecute him. Tyranny is not merely power. It is power used without justice. These are people who act driven by self-interest, pride, and violence. They do not seek truth or justice. They seek only to satisfy their own desires. When power turns away from God, it easily transforms into oppression. The verse also shows that the threat is not merely symbolic. David clearly states that they seek to take his life. This reveals the extreme level of the conflict. This is not mild criticism or opposition. It is real persecution. David's life is at risk. Even so, he chooses to bring this reality before God in prayer, acknowledging that only the Lord can protect him. The final phrase reveals the root of the problem: they have no God before them. This is the true spiritual diagnosis of human wickedness. When someone lives as if God did not exist, moral boundaries disappear. Conscience becomes silent and the heart hardens. Without divine guidance, power, envy, and selfishness begin to direct decisions. This verse reminds us that many conflicts in human history arise precisely from this absence of God in the heart. When God is not considered, justice weakens and one's neighbor ceases to be seen with dignity. David understands that the problem is not merely political or personal, it is spiritual. Behind the persecution lies a heart that has rejected the presence and authority of the Lord. In modern times, this verse remains extremely relevant. We often face environments where spiritual values are ignored and where decisions are made without any fear of God. People may act unjustly, manipulatively, or cruelly because they live as if there were no judge above all. In light of this, the psalm teaches us not to respond only with anger, but with spiritual discernment. Instead of allowing fear to dominate our hearts, we can take our struggles to God, remembering that He sees what men ignore and that ultimate justice always belongs to the Lord. To reflect, when faced with injustice or attacks, do I first seek God's help or try to resolve everything with my own strength? Have I noticed how the absence of God in the human heart can influence attitudes and decisions around me? Even in difficult environments, am I able to maintain my confidence that God sees, judges, and protects?
Verse 4. Behold, God is my helper. The Lord is with those who uphold my life.
After describing the persecution and danger around him, David completely changes the tone of the psalm. He moves away from describing the threat and into a declaration of faith. The word, behold, functions as a call to attention, as if saying, look at this, perceive this truth. Even surrounded by enemies, David does not allow fear to be the last word. He points to the greater reality: God is his helper. By stating that God is his helper, David acknowledges that his strength is not in himself. This statement reveals spiritual humility. He understands that, in the face of unjust and dangerous forces, human beings alone are limited. True help comes from the Lord. This help is not merely symbolic or emotional. It is a real intervention of God in the lives of those who trust in him. The verse continues with an even deeper statement: "The Lord is with those who uphold my life." This indicates that David recognizes that God uses people to provide support and protection. Friends, allies, and faithful people can be instruments of divine providence. God's care often manifests itself through relationships that strengthen and sustain. This vision shows that David does not feel completely alone, even in the midst of persecution. He understands that God is present and that there is a circle of support preserved by divine grace. Faith does not eliminate difficulties, but it changes the way they are faced. Instead of despair, confidence arises that God is active, sustaining, and defending. There is also a very important spiritual dimension to this statement. David acknowledges that his life is in God's hands. Those who support him do so because the Lord is working through them. This shows a mature spiritual understanding. Behind all true help is the invisible hand of God guiding, protecting, and preserving life. In modern times, this verse remains a profound source of encouragement. In moments of pressure, injustice, or loneliness, we can remember that God continues to be a helper to those who trust in him. Often he raises up unexpected people, circumstances, and paths to sustain us. When we recognize this, our perspective changes. Instead of focusing only on the threats, we begin to see the signs of God's faithfulness at work around us. To reflect: when I face difficult times, do I acknowledge God as my true helper, or do I try to carry everything alone? Have I noticed the people and circumstances God uses to sustain my life? Is my trust in my own strength or in the faithful help of the Lord who never abandons those who trust in him?
Verse 5: He will repay evil to my enemies. In your faithfulness, destroy them.
David continues his prayer, expressing confidence in God's justice. Instead of seeking revenge with his own hands, he entrusts his cause to the Lord. The expression, "He will repay evil to my enemies," shows that David believes God is just and that no injustice goes unnoticed before him. The Lord knows the intentions, actions, and ways of every person. This statement reveals an important spiritual truth: God is the righteous judge. Often, when someone wrongs us, the temptation arises to retaliate, respond with the same aggression, or harbor resentment. However, David chooses to trust that God himself will handle the situation. He entrusts the judgment to the Lord, recognizing that divine justice is perfect. When David asks God to destroy his enemies in your faithfulness, he is appealing to the Lord's character. God's faithfulness means not only kindness to the righteous, but also commitment to truth and justice. The Lord remains true to his own nature. This means that he does not ignore evil, but neither does he act unjustly or impulsively. This verse also reveals David's deep trust in the covenant with God. He knows that the Lord is faithful to those who walk in his presence. Therefore, when he entrusts his cause to God, he is not only asking for protection, but declaring that he trusts in the divine character. The Lord's faithfulness is the foundation of his hope. There is another important detail in this request. David is not celebrating the suffering of his enemies, but affirming that evil will not have the final say. He acknowledges that evil needs to be confronted and that God's justice restores the moral order of the world. This confidence brings rest to the heart that suffers injustice. In these times, this verse teaches us something extremely liberating. When we are hurt or wronged, we don't need to live trapped by the desire for revenge. We can trust that God sees all things and that His justice will prevail in due time. This allows us to move forward with a free heart, knowing that the Lord remains faithful and that He takes care of our cause better than we could ourselves. To reflect, when I am wronged, do I seek revenge, or can I trust that God is the righteous judge? Have I surrendered to the Lord the pain caused by those who hurt me? Is my faith in God's faithfulness strong enough to allow me to live without carrying the weight of resentment?
Verse 6. I will freely offer sacrifices to you. I will praise your name, Lord, for it is good.
After pleading for deliverance and affirming his trust in divine justice, David now expresses something profoundly significant: anticipatory gratitude. Even before seeing the complete resolution of his situation, he declares that he will offer free will sacrifices to the Lord. This reveals a heart that does not serve God only when all is well, but chooses to honor Him for who He is. The expression of his own free will shows that David's praise does not stem from religious obligation, but from a spontaneous heart. In the context of the Old Testament, voluntary sacrifices were offerings of gratitude and devotion. They were not required as part of a mandatory ritual, but were presented as a sincere expression of love and recognition to God. David also states that he will praise the name of the Lord because He is good. This statement points to God's unchanging character. Even when circumstances seem difficult or threatening, the Lord's goodness remains the same. David bases his praise not only on what God does, but primarily on who God is. This verse also reveals an important shift in the tone of the prayer. The psalm began with an urgent cry for help, but now ends with adoration. This shows the spiritual movement that occurs when we place our trust in God. The heart that begins in anguish can end in praise, because it finds rest in the Lord's faithfulness. Furthermore, David teaches that gratitude should not wait only for the final result. Often, the greatest act of faith is to thank God even before seeing the complete answer. Praising Him in the midst of waiting demonstrates deep trust in the Lord's character and goodness. In these times, this verse invites us to cultivate a heart that praises God freely and sincerely, not only when we receive what we ask for, but because we recognize that the Lord is good at all times. When we learn to worship God in this way, our faith is strengthened and our relationship with Him becomes deeper and more genuine. To reflect, does my worship of God stem from obligation or from a willing and grateful heart? Have I recognized the Lord's goodness even before seeing all the answers I expect? Does my praise depend on circumstances, or is it grounded in God's unchanging character?
Verse 7. For He delivered me from all my troubles, and my eyes have seen the defeat of my enemies.
David concludes this psalm with a statement of testimony. After crying out for help and reaffirming his trust in God, he proclaims that the Lord delivered him from all his troubles. This statement is not merely a record of a specific moment, but the expression of a lifelong experience. God is the one who intervenes, helps, and guides His servants through crises. The word anguish points to profound pressures, situations that surround life on all sides and seem to stifle hope. David had faced betrayals, persecutions, and death threats, but he recognizes that, in each of these circumstances, the Lord was his deliverance. The deliverance did not come from human strength, but from God's faithfulness. When David says that his eyes have seen the defeat of his enemies, he is not celebrating personal vengeance, but witnessing divine justice. Those who rose up in violence and arrogance did not prevail in the end. God acted at the right time, revealing that no opposition can stand before His justice. This verse also reveals something important about spiritual memory. David looks back and acknowledges what God has already done. Remembering past deliverances strengthens faith to face present challenges. Those who learn to recall God's interventions find courage to continue trusting even in uncertain times. Thus, the psalm ends with a heart that has moved from threat to testimony, from cry to gratitude. David began by asking for help, but ends by proclaiming victory. This spiritual movement shows that trust in God transforms not only circumstances, but also the way the heart perceives reality. In these times, this verse invites us to look at our own history and recognize the moments when God sustained us. We often quickly forget the deliverances we received, but when we remember the Lord's faithfulness, our faith is strengthened and our hope is renewed. The God who delivered us yesterday continues to be the same God who acts today. To reflect, have I acknowledged and remembered the deliverances God has already performed in my life? When I face difficulties, do I choose to trust that the Lord continues to be my deliverer? Is my faith strengthened by remembering God's faithfulness in the past? We can conclude that Psalm 54 leads us on a spiritual path that begins with threat, passes through cries of distress, and ends in trust. It reminds us that true faith is not born from the absence of problems, but from the certainty that God is present in their midst. When voices of accusation rise up and when unjust forces seem to organize against us, there is still a safe place, the name of the Lord. David teaches us that the heart that cries out is not alone. God hears, God sees, and God intervenes. And when he rises up in favor of his own, no opposition has the final word. This psalm also confronts us with a profound spiritual choice. We can try to resolve our battles with only our own strength, or we can learn to depend on the one who sustains all things. Trust in God is not passivity. It is a posture of faith that refuses to allow fear to rule the heart. Those who learn to trust in the Lord find firmness even when the surrounding scenario seems unstable. Deliverance may not come when we expect it, but it always comes in God's perfect timing. And when it comes, it reveals that we were never truly helpless. Thus, Psalm 54 invites us to live with a heart that prays, trusts, and gives thanks. It reminds us that every cry heard by God is transformed, in due time, into a testimony. What seems like anguish today may be remembered as deliverance tomorrow. What brings tears today may become a reason for gratitude. The God who heard David continues to hear those who cry out sincerely. And everyone who places their life in the Lord's hands will discover that, above the threats of the world, there is a faithfulness that never fails and a God who never abandons his own. Now that we understand the meaning of each verse of Psalm 54, I invite you to continue meditating and praying for another 6 days, allowing this message about crying out in the midst of persecution, trusting in divine help, and the certainty of the Lord's deliverance to penetrate even deeper into your heart. Read each verse as a reminder that God hears the prayer of those who call upon him and sustains those who place their trust in him. Reflect daily on the Lord's call. Recognize that true security is not in human strength, but in seeking God, trusting in his faithfulness, and resting in the certainty that he is the help of those who call upon his name. And to seal this message in our hearts, we invite you to pray and keep with you this prayer inspired by Psalm 54. Return to it whenever you need to remember that, even when enemies rise up or when unjust situations seem to surround life, the Lord continues to be the faithful help of those who trust in him. When the heart needs to renew its courage, or when the soul desires to reaffirm its hope in the deliverance that comes from God. Remember that the Lord inclines to hear the sincere cry and sustains those who depend on him. May this psalm be a guide to living with faith, courage, and gratitude, keeping your heart steadfast in the God who saves, helps, and leads his children to safety.
Prayer inspired by Psalm 54. Almighty God, my liberator and my refuge, today I stand before you with an open and trusting heart. Just as David cried out in the midst of persecution, I too raise my voice and ask, save me in your name and do justice by your strength. You know every hidden struggle, every silent threat, and every burden that the heart carries. Nothing is hidden from your eyes, and no pain goes unnoticed in your presence. Incline your ears to my prayer, and hear the cry that rises from my soul. May your name, which is powerful and holy, be my defense, my protection, and my help at all times. Eternal Father, when opposing forces arise and when circumstances seem to surround my path, remind me that you are by my side. You are the help of those who trust in you, the sustainer of life, and the guardian of those who seek you sincerely. Strengthen my faith so that I may not walk dominated by fear, but sustained by the certainty that you govern all things. Teach me to trust in your justice, even when I do not understand the timing of the answers. May my hope not be in my own strength, but in the faithfulness of your character. And may my soul remain steadfast, knowing that the Lord never abandons those who call upon his name. Therefore, Lord, I offer you praise with gratitude and joy, because I know that you are good and faithful at all times. Even before fully witnessing deliverance, I choose to give thanks, because I trust in your action and your goodness. Deliver me from all evil, guard my steps, and guide my life according to your truth. May my heart learn to celebrate not only the answers, but also your constant presence by my side. Plant in me a courageous faith, capable of remaining steadfast amidst life's battles. And may my whole life be a testament that those who trust in the Lord are never abandoned. In the name of Jesus, amen.
Now I want to reinforce the invitation I made at the beginning. If this message has edified your life, like the video and share it with someone who needs to be reminded that God is just, faithful, and sovereign, the one who hears the cry of those who call upon him, sustains those who trust in his name, and intervenes with power to bring deliverance to those who seek his help. Psalm 54 teaches us that even when surrounded by adversity, persecution, or injustice, we can cry out to the Lord with confidence, knowing that he is our help and sustainer. David shows us that true security lies not in human strength, but in the powerful name of God, who saves, protects, and brings justice in due time. Those who learn to trust in the Lord's help find courage to face life's battles and strength to continue walking in faith. And before we finish, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and leave your prayer request in the comments. It will be a joy to intercede for you. May God illuminate your understanding, strengthen your faith, and guide your steps on the path of trust, helping you to live with courage, hope, and daily faithfulness before the Lord. Until the next video, may God bless your life, your family, and your business.